Welcome to the Lense Housing tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you all the steps necessary to create this lens housing part. First, we're going to set up the workspace. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the trackball, and at the bottom of the trackball, I'm going to change the view to top if it's not already set that way. Next, we'll go to the window menu, and we'll open up the Show Hide palette, go back to the window menu, and we're going to show the Snaps palette as well. I'm also going to close the surfacing palette. No surfaces will be created in this tutorial, and I'm just going to move the solids palette up, make it more convenient. You don't have to do this. Okay, let's begin. First thing we're going to do is create a circle. We're going to use the center point circle tool. I'm going to click at the origin, drag up the Y direction, click again. Then in the diameter field, I'm going to click a value of 10 and hit enter. Then I'm going to simply type a value of 12.5 and hit enter again. Notice how it created a second circle. I didn't have to touch anything. Let's switch over to the isometric view. Then we're going to hop on over to the planes menu, and I'm going to show work plane. And notice the work plane indicator shows up at the origin of the drawing. It's also shown here up in the triad as well. I'm going to select the circle, and then with my mouse held over the vertex, I'm not clicking, I'm just holding my mouse over the vertex. I'm going to tap the C key. That's the letter C key on the keyboard. Notice every time I tap the C key, it cycles through the XY, the YZ, the XZ, and the user view planes. In this case, we're going to use the YZ plane, and notice how the plane indicator on the triad shows this as well. Now we're going to go up to the Pen menu into Color, and then we're going to choose More, so that we open up the pen palette, and I'm going to choose a new color for this next set of geometry. Now over in the Snaps palette, I'm going to check the work plane snap, and what this does is it keeps our geometry constrained to the work plane indicator. I'm going to use the connected line tool, and I'm going to drag up in the Y direction, and I'm going to type in a value of 1.5 and hit enter. Then I'm going to drag over into the Z direction, click, and then type in 0.065 and hit enter. Then I'm going to drag back up again, click, type in a value of 0.1, and hit enter. And what this has done is it's created this set of lines. Now I need to keep going with that, but instead of just drawing lines over and over and over again, I'm going to use the linear duplicate tool, and I know I want a total of 9 of these. I'm going to hit the Tab key, and then I'm going to click and drag from one corner to the other, and notice the values are filled in automatically. When I hit OK, it creates the stairs for me. Back to the connected line tool, I'm going to click and drag again, a value of 0.3, come back down, click and drag, click, and then type in a value of 0.6, hit enter. And then I'm going to start the tool again, come back down to the beginning, click to the end point, click back up, type in a value of 1.5, and then just use the drafting assistant to snap to that line we created before. Let's go ahead and lathe the profile now. So I'm going to turn off the work plane snap. It's a good idea to save your file at this time too. Let's do a zoom all. I'm going to use the single line tool, and I'm going to drag a line down from the center of the circle, and I'm going to use that as a lathe axis later. So we're going to choose the lathe tool. Up in the message line, select Objects to Lathe. I'm going to drag a selection box around my profile, and then it's asking for a line for a lathe axis. I'll pick the line in the center that we drew earlier, and now we have our part. You'll notice our part after it's been created looks kind of jagged, doesn't look smooth, and that's because the screen resolution isn't set to be very high. So what I'm going to do is select the object, go up to the Edit menu, and choose Change Resolution. And notice it was set to medium, so I'm just going to click Superfine and click OK. Now that only affects the geometry we just created, but if we want all of our objects from here on out to be smooth, we'll go into the Preferences, click the Display category, and notice how for each object type I can change it to be superfine. So from solid to surface, I'm going to choose superfine. And from surface, we can choose curves. And curves I already had set to superfine, so I'll go ahead and hit OK. Now everything will be smooth from here on out. Let's continue building our part. Now when we made that profile before, we made the edges square. But I know I want my part to be blended on the edges, so I'm going to use the Radial Blend tool. I'm going to set a value of 0.25, and I'm going to click this first edge. I'm going to go ahead and type in a value of 0.5 and click the second edge. And I think it's best if you always let the program do the blending whenever it can. So instead of drawing those blends in the profile, I simply put the blends on the solid later on. Now I'm going to go ahead and highlight the part, and I'm going to highlight the lathe axis. I'm going to go over to the Show Hide menu, and I'm going to just click on Hide. I'm going to drag a selection box around the profile that we created, then I'm going to click on Hide again. This gets us back to our original two circles. Up in the Planes menu, I'm going to uncheck Show Work Plane so it goes away. Now we're going to create some extrusions that are going to simulate the focus ring on a camera lens. So let's hop back to the top view. I'm going to use the spacebar to pan tool to drag the view down a little bit. Then I'm going to zoom in to the top of our circles. I'm going to change my color again so I can keep track of my geometry. I'm going to use the center point circle tool, only this time I'm going to simply type in a value of 0.6, and for the X I'm going to type in 0.6. For Y I'm going to type in 1.35, and Z I'm going to leave it 0. And I'm simply going to hit the Enter key on the keyboard. Notice it draws my circle for me right where I wanted it. In this case I knew where the circle was going to go, so I went ahead and typed in the values. We're going to select that circle. Then we're going to come over to the Polar Duplicate tool. I know I want a total of 34. Then I'm going to tab down to the center X value, and notice how the cursor changes to a crosshair. I'm simply going to click in the center point of my circle, or the origin of the drawing. Then I click OK, and it draws those circles for me. I'm going to hop over to Isometric View using the F key on the keyboard. And since I have all my circles drawn with a nice green color, this will make it easier to select using the Select Mask. So under the Window menu, I'm going to open Select Mask, and the Select Mask will show everything possible in a drawing, but I only want it to show what's in my drawing, so I'm going to click Show Attributes Used by Entities. And I'm going to turn off the medium blue color. So now, when I do a Select All, it only selects the lawn green colors in the drawing. Now I'll choose the Extrude Solid tool, and I'm simply going to click 2 points away from the drawing, follow up in the Y direction, and it's going to extrude all of those circles at one time for me. Then I'm going to type in a distance of 2 and hit Enter. Back to the Select Mask, I'm going to click the Select All button in the Select Mask, and what that does is it resets it so everything is now active or available to the Select All. And don't get that confused with the Select All in the Edit menu, which is selecting geometry. So because I extruded all of this geometry at one time, it makes it all one selection set. So clicking any one of those cylinders will highlight the whole set. I'm going to go over to the Show Hide palette, and I'm going to click on the Show option. And what this will do is show everything that was hidden in a ghosted form until I click on it, and then it brings it back into the drawing. So I've clicked on our lathe that we did before, and now it's part of the drawing. Now we'll choose the Subtract Solid tool, and notice it says Pick Solid to Subtract From. So I want to remove parts from this lathe. It says Pick Solid or Surface to Subtract. So I want to subtract those cylinders. Remember, just by clicking one of them, because I extruded them all together, it's going to count as one selection set. So it subtracts all of those cylinders from our ring. Click on Show Only, so it just shows our part, and we have a nice looking solid part. In order to keep my drawing clean, I like to move geometry I'm not going to use anymore to a new layer. So I'm going to click the Show All from the Show Hide palette. Then I'm going to highlight my solid part, and then I'm going to hide it from the Show Hide palette. This shows all of my wireframe geometry I used before. Now I'm simply going to hit Apple A to do a Select All. I'm going to go to the Window menu, choose the Design Explorer, and then click on the Layer Manager tab. Double-click Layer 1's name, so it will rename it, and I'm going to choose to rename it Lens. Then I'm going to go down to the bottom of the Layer Manager palette, and I'm going to choose Create a New Sublayer, and it's now called Lens 1, and notice it's a sublayer of Lens. I'm going to go into the Window menu, and I'm going to open up Edit Objects. Because all of my objects are selected, it shows me that they're in Lens layer. But I'm going to pull that down and choose Lens 1 and hit Apply, and notice how it moved 59 of my 60 objects to that Lens 1 layer. I'm going to turn off that layer, and now all of my geometry is gone. But because I hid my solid part before, I can simply do Show All in the Show Hide palette, and now it's the only thing on the screen. So the first thing I'm going to do is I need to get my work plane back to the origin, and the easiest way to do that is to go down to the work plane indicator down at the bottom left and choose Global Work Plane. This will reset my work plane back to the origin of the drawing. Now I'm going to open up the Design Explorer again, and I'm going to click on the Create New Layer button. It's the first one on the left. And I'm going to right mouse click this time and choose Rename. I'm going to rename this one Base. I'm also going to click in the first box on the left, which will make this the active layer. So any geometry I create now will go onto the base layer. I'll switch back to the top view by simply tapping the letter D on the keyboard. Then I'll go into the Pen, Color, More, and I'm going to choose another color for this next set of lines. Now I'll select the Single Line tool, and I'm going to click the center, come over the X direction and click again. Then I'm going to type in a value of 10. I'll click the center again. This time we'll go down the Y direction, click, and we'll type in a value of 14.5 and hit Enter. Now I'm going to hide my part from the screen because I don't need it showing on the screen anymore. I'll tap the letter F on my keyboard, and that will switch me to isometric view mode. Then we're going to highlight that top line and hold our mouse over the endpoint. We're going to tap the letter C on the keyboard twice to give us the YZ plane. In the Snaps menu, we'll choose the work plane. Then I've created a shortcut for my pen menu, and I'm just going to open that and change colors once again. Let's go choose the Connected Line tool. Let's click on that endpoint, and we're going to drag out, click, and we're going to type in a value of 10.6 and hit Enter. Then we'll come up the Y direction, click, and we're going to type in a value of 0.6. Then we're going to come out the X direction again, click, and we're going to type in a value of 2.3. Hit Enter. I'll go up and I'll click the Selection tool, and I'm simply going to tap the letter A on my keyboard, which will flip us over to the right side view. Then I'm going to use the Single Line tool. I'm going to click on that endpoint, and I'm going to come down perpendicular from that line, click, and then I'm going to type in a value of 1.65, hit the Tab key, and type in a value of 260 for the angle field and hit Enter. And it created that angled line for me. We'll start a new line at the endpoint of the angled line. We'll come over the X direction and we'll type in a value of 0.6 and hit Enter. After doing a Zoom All, I'm going to use the Connected Line tool. I'm going to click our original start point, and I'm going to come up the Y direction and click again, type in a value of 1.2 and hit Enter. Then I'm going to come out the X direction, and I'm just going to draw a line that's longer than the geometry we drew before. I don't really care how long this is. We'll switch to right view. Then I'm going to zoom in close to the endpoints of those two lines that we have. Now I'll choose the Parallel Line tool, and what this does is it drags off a line based on an existing line. So I'll choose the angled line. Then I'm going to snap to the endpoint of this short line, and notice how this line is a little bit shorter than we need it. So I'm going to use the Trim tool, and the message line says Pick Selection to Trim. Shift equals Select Boundary. Option equals Relimit. So I'll hold down the Shift key, and I'll select the two lines. Then I'll hold the Option key down, which flips it over to the Relimit tool. I'll relimit the short line. It will extend its boundaries, and then I'll just simply trim off the end of the other line. Now I'll use the Selection tool to select the angled line. Then I'm going to hold my cursor over the endpoint of that line, and I'm going to tap the C key so that it moves the work plane to the endpoint of that line. I'll switch back to the top view by simply tapping the letter D on the keyboard. We use the 3-point arc tool, and we're going to also turn on the work plane. So we're going to click our first point at the work plane, second point at the endpoint of the line, and then using the drafting assistant, we're just going to snap to a point that's based off of the first point we clicked. In the message line, I'm simply going to change the X3 value, which is the third point we clicked, to -20, and this will make our arc uniform on both sides. Now with the selection tool, I'm going to select that arc we just drew. And with my shortcut, I'm going to open up the pen palette again, and I'm going to change colors of this arc, just to keep it different from the other colors. Now what we want to do is we want to extrude this shape along that arc, and for that we're going to use the Swept Solid tool. We also want to change its setting to Sweep Rigid so that it stays straight on both sides. Now we need to select all the parts of this profile, and there's an easy way to do this using the Select Chain, which is Apple tilde, the shortcut menu. But notice our message line says Select Profile to Sweep, Shift equals Extend. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and I'm going to click this top line. Then I'm going to tap the Apple and the tilde key, and notice how it follows the chain around that profile, but it also selects two other lines that are connected to it. So I'm going to keep Shift held down and I'm going to deselect those two other lines. With the profile selected, now I'm going to pick curves for the sweep path, which is just that arc. Once I select that, it sweeps that profile along the arc. And this creates a nice smooth extrusion along that arc. Now I'll turn the work plane off, and I'm going to go down and I'm going to blend these edges on the bottom of this part, which I could have done to the wireframe originally, but this time I'll choose to use the radial blend tool. So I want to put a blend right here, but I need to switch to wireframe view so I can see it. And with my radius set to 0.5, I'll click that first edge, then I'll change my radius to 1 and click the outer edge. Now we've got a nice blend in there. When we show that in solid mode, it looks really good. Now I'm going to show you how to edit your part after it's been created. Let's go ahead and show our other solid, and notice the center of the solid is a bit higher than the edge of the solid we just created. What I want to do is move that edge upward but keep the rest of the part where it is. For this I'm going to choose the selection mask, and I'm going to turn off solid selection so I'm only able to click wireframe entities. I can also choose to have this palette collapse to the top so it stays open but it's still there. I'll go ahead and pan over, and I'm going to zoom in to this corner. I'm going to drag a selection around two endpoints and the one line. And where I could just click and drag to pull these lines over, I'm going to use the Move tool and click one point, come out the Y direction and click again. And notice I'm actually just editing wireframe geometry here, but because that wireframe has history, the solid updates as a result. Type in a value of 1, and now notice that this part extends past the center. I'm going to go back into Select Mask, and I'm going to choose Select All, then I'm going to close it down. So if I hop to wireframe mode, notice that my center of that arc piece is now above the origin. Now I want to show you a technique called Overbuilding Geometry. I'm going to cut this solid to be straight, and I'm going to use a line as the cutting tool. But instead of making this line share edges with that solid piece, I'm going to actually make it a little bit longer than it needs to be. I'm also going to go ahead and change the colors. Notice how it extends past the solid a little bit more than it needs to. I'm going to choose the Trim Solid tool, and the message line says pick curve or surface to trim solid. When I pick that curve, little arrows show which direction is going to be cut off. Then I choose the solid to be cut, but notice it's the wrong side. Simply tapping the Option key will reverse the portion that gets removed. So you can see I now have the portion that I want. Let's go ahead and switch back to shaded mode. Now what we want to do is we want to cut out the center portion of the ring of our solid. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the Layer Manager, and I'm going to show that Lens 1 layer. Then I'm going to click on my Subtract object, and I'm going to hide it. And there's the circle, and I could use that circle as my cutting object. But remember, since we're overbuilding, I want this geometry to be a little bit bigger than it needs to be. So I'm going to create a new circle from the midpoint, snapping to the quadrant, but just a little bit bigger. Now I've created a new circle that I'll use to cut out that solid. So let's go ahead and turn off our Lens 1 layer. I'm going to switch over to shaded mode, trim solid. I'm going to pick that circle as the cutting object. Then I'm going to click on my solid, and now we have the cutout. Come back over to show all, you can see that that object has a good clearing now. I can also right mouse click an object and choose to show it transparent so you can see how well that object fits in there. Let's turn off transparency again. Now we're going to create the flared edges of this piece. For that we're going to use the Tangent Point Arc tool. So I'll simply touch the tool to the edge of our ring piece, follow the drafting assistant down until I get well past the part. I'm going to click the first point, then I'm going to come up and click and drag out this arc. Switch back over to wireframe mode. I need to create an identical arc to this to the other side, but there's no point in creating the geometry again when I can just use the mirror tool. Pick beginning of reference line, Option equals copy. So I'm going to hold down the Option key and I'm going to click where I know the center of my object is, and I'm going to drag down in the Y direction. This creates an exact mirror copy of the original arc that I drew. Switch back over to shaded mode. We're going to use our Trim Solid tool again. Pick that mirror copied arc as a cutting line, then click the solid. Click our original arc and cut the solid. Now we have our final shaped piece. Looks good. So I'm simply going to highlight the two solids and click Show Only. Then I'm going to go choose the Union Solid tool. Pick solid to add to. We're going to add to the ring, and then we're going to click the new solid piece, and the two get joined as one. So you see when I click on it, it's all one piece now. I want to make a couple of edits on this part as well. It looks like it's a little too thick, so I'm going to show that wireframe geometry profile again. And I also think it's a little bit too high. I'd prefer not to have it cut into one of those sections. So I want to move that edge down. The first thing we'll do is deal with the thickness. I'm going to use the Show palette. I'm going to hold down Shift and I'm going to click these three lines on my original profile. Those three show up. So I'll hold down the Shift key. What I want to do is I want to drag a selection box around the endpoint, click the line, and drag another selection around the endpoint. I'm going to use the Move tool, and I'm going to go ahead and click the endpoint and click a second point down on the line. Notice how it updates and my part gets shorter because of part history. I can also type in the value for the exact length I want to move it, in this case 0.2. Now we want to show the line we used to cut our part originally. Use the Move tool, and I'm simply going to click 2 points. When that updates, the part is redrawn. The Ashlar-Vellum solid modeling programs support the Illustrator format as an import option. So what we're going to do is we're going to show only our solid part. Then I'm going to show that line that draws down the center point of our part. I'm going to switch over to wireframe viewing mode. Then I'm going to create a new layer. And this time I'm going to call this layer Logo. And I'm also going to click to make this layer the active layer. This way when I import my logo, it'll go to this layer. Let's choose File, Import, and let's choose Adobe Illustrator for the import type. Let's also check the Group Curve Segments and the Join Curve Segments options and click OK. Then we'll browse for our Illustrator file, and I've saved my Illustrator file in version 8. Click OK and it imports my logo, so I'm going to highlight the logo. Then I'm going to go down and I'm going to choose the Move tool. I'm going to click the first point or the reference point in the middle of my logo, and then I'm going to click my ending reference point or where I want it to go on the line. Notice the logo moves. It's also a little too small, so I'm going to use the Expand Shrink or Scale tool, as we call it, to make it a bit bigger. So I'm going to pick an anchor point in the middle of my part. Then I'll type in a value of 1.5 and simply hit Enter on the keyboard. That looks a lot better. Let's extrude the logo now so that we can subtract it out of the face of our part. First thing we need to do, though, is we need to move the logo up so that it's inside of the part. I'm going to hold my mouse over the logo and simply tap the C key. This brings up the work plane again, and I'm going to turn the work plane snap back on. Then I'm going to use the Move tool, and I'm going to click 2 points, one where the logo is, and one where I want the logo to go. And it moves up to a nice spot in the part. I'm going to turn off the work plane snap. Then I'm going to choose the Extrude Solid tool. The Extrude Solid tool simply wants 2 points as an extrusion. So I will click 2 points, and the logo is extruded. Now we're going to subtract the logo from the face of our part. For that, we're going to use the Subtract Solid tool. So pick the solid that we want to subtract from, and then click the logo. And notice how the logo is now removed from the solid part. Let's switch to shaded mode and show you our final part. We've covered a lot of information in this tutorial, and you may need to go back and watch it a few times before you get everything just right. Good luck and happy modeling!